Hey y'all, and welcome back for another episode of the Weekend Weird Files. As you know, I'm your host Andrea, and boy do I have one heck of a story for y'all today. So let's go ahead and get started. Triple M Studios present the Weekend Weird Files. Here's your host Andrea Lee. All right. Well, so have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Evan Byers? Well, that's who we're talking about today, and his story is pretty interesting. Very tragic, weird, and just plain one of those WTF things. Now, it's okay if you've never heard of him or what happened to him, because I'm going to fill you in on all of that. And I know y'all are just so thankful to have me sharing the knowledge. His name is Eben, and it's spelled E-B-E-N, and it's short for Ebenezer. He was born into a wealthy family in 1880 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After he graduated from Yale, he decided to pursue the sport that he loved, and that was golf. And I mean, why not? He didn't have to go to work because he had more money than he knew what to do with. So why would he go sit behind a boring desk, right? Well, Eben was really good at golf, and in 1906, he won the U.S. Amateur Golf Championship. So he was pretty good at it, I would say. Well, in 1927, while he was returning back to Pittsburgh from the Harvard versus Yale football game, he was on a train, and he decided that he would climb up into the top bunk in the sleeping car and get some sleep. Well, at some point during his snooze, he rolled out of the bed and he landed really hard on his left side. And when he started pulling himself up off the floor, he realized that he had hurt his shoulder. And it was in a big amount of pain, I would say. So he climbed back in the bed and he managed to go back to sleep. But when, the train arrived in Pittsburgh, when it pulled into the station, he prepared to get off the train. He realized that he was still in a big amount of pain. So he gathered his luggage, dropped it off at his house, and then he decided he should probably have that shoulder checked out. So he went to his physical therapist's office. Well, the therapist checked him out and decided that he didn't have any breaks or tear as far as he could tell. But he also could tell that Evan was in a lot of pain. So he started telling him about this fantastic new drug that would not only make the pain go away, but it would make him feel like a brand new man. This new drug was basically a cure-all, and it cured everything, including impotence. It was a bit expensive, but remember, Evan could cover it because, he was born into that rich family and he had a ton of money. So his therapist wrote him a prescription for it, and it was called Radithor. Well, let's talk about this Radithor for a minute. It was patented by a guy named William J.A. Bailey, and he wasn't a doctor, but he claimed to be one, and he didn't even finish college. He had actually dropped out of Harvard. Now, for some reason, I just keep thinking about this, that one episode of the Andy Griffith Show where Aunt Bee and her friends had gotten that miracle elixir tonic stuff from the traveling salesman guy, and they all basically got drunk. But this story isn't funny like that, and it's not how the story goes. Not even close to how the story goes. Now, the dose for Radithor was a small spoonful. And after just the very first dose, Evan was almost instantly feeling better. So he continued taking his dose faithfully each day. His shoulder was feeling better, and he had a little pep in his step. Soon he was pretty much addicted to it, and he was going through bottles of Radithor very quickly. And I'm talking some days he would go through 3 bottles in one day. And over the next several years, he drank a total of somewhere around 1,400 bottles of the stuff. Well, of course you know what they say about getting too much of a good thing. His bottom jaw fell off. Yes, fell off. So what was in that Radithor? Well, it turns out Radithor was created by dissolving high concentrations of radium, okay, in distilled water. Bailey advertised this as a cure for the living dead, and he gave doctors who prescribed it a 17% commission on every single dose that they prescribed. By the time Evan had stopped taking the Radithor in 1930, he had taken more than 3 times the lethal dose of radium. His upper and lower jaw literally dissolved, and they called that radium jaw. They had to surgically remove the tissue that was deteriorating, and it left a very hideous gaping hole where he used to have a mouth. He also had abscesses on his brain, and his skull was full of holes. Now, Evan passed away on March 31st, 1932, at the age of 51. He's entombed in the Byers Mausoleum in the Pittsburgh Allegheny Cemetery in a lead-lined coffin that was designed to absorb the radiation that will continue to emit from his body for years to come. Well, in 1965, they exhumed his body, and get this, the radiation levels were still dangerously high, 33 years after he died. See, I told you there was a lot of WTF to this story. So what happened to Radithor's inventor, Bailey? Well, the FDA shut his company down, but the Radithor had already made him a very wealthy man. So he used the money that he earned from Radithor to start another company that made other items, like a device that people could use to make their own radioactive water, a radioactive belt clip, and paperweights. I mean, the man just didn't get it. And I'm sure if something like that were to happen these days, he wouldn't have had the money to start another company, because the families of his victims from taking that medicine would sue him, and we would be seeing the lawsuit commercials on TV right now. Have you or a loved one been affected by Radithor? If you have, you may be entitled to compensation. Now, this isn't the only time that the use of radium caused a stir back in history, and it really wasn't even the first time either. Have you ever heard of the Radium Girls? Back around 1917, there was a factory in Orange, New Jersey called United States Radium. And this is where the Radium Girls worked. Their job was to paint dial numbers that glow in the dark. And it was made with it was painted with this glow in the dark paint that was made from radium. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. The owners and scientists that were there at that factory knew that the effects of being exposed to radium would cause, and they were very adamant about avoiding exposure to it themselves, but apparently they didn't really care anything about their other employees there at the factory. Now, to make the glow-in-the-dark paint, they would mix glue, water, and radium powder, and they would use camel hair paint brushes to put the paint onto the dial numbers. Well, after just a few strokes with those paint brushes, the brushes would lose their shape. So I guess you could say sharpen them, the employees, supervisors, would actually encourage them to use their lips and tongues. And I think it was pretty sick that they encouraged them to do that when they knew, they're at the plant, all the higher ups, they knew full well what the dangers were. And for fun, because they didn't know any better, the girls would paint their fingernails, teeth, and even their faces with the radioactive paint. But, they didn't know what it would cause at that time. Well, soon they started figuring out, because these women started suffering from anemia. They would have random bone fractures and even necrosis of the jaw, which is pretty much where Evan's problems had started. Now, it was alleged that the x-ray machines that were used in the medical investigations may have had some effect on the workers' symptoms and made them worse because they were being exposed to additional radiation. But it turns out that was just a campaign to spread false information that was started by the company's defense contractor. Now, U.S. Radium and other companies like them denied that their workers were suffering from exposure to radium. If a worker died from the exposure, medical professionals claimed that their deaths were from other medical issues because those companies were urging them to not use radium as the excuse or the reason for these people dying. And they would even use syphilis as a cause of death to smear the reputations of those women that worked there. It's just sick. But anyway, one of the workers, her name was Grace Fryer, and she decided she was going to sue U.S. Radium. But it took her about 2 years to find a lawyer that would take her case. But when she did, 5 more of the factory workers joined her in the lawsuit, and they nicknamed this group of women the Radium Girls. Now, the lawsuit, it became quite the media sensation, and in turn it brought about regulations that govern labor safety standards. The entire Radium Girls story is a major bookmark in history because of its impact on the labor rights movement. Their lawsuit established the ability for individual workers to sue for damages to corporations because of labor abuse. The case was finally settled in 1928, and each of the Radium Girls received $10,000. And back then, that was the equivalent of around $130,000. Now, in addition to that, they received $600 a year as long as they were alive, plus all of their legal and medical expenses were paid for by the company, too. So, yeah, it was a very horrible thing that happened to these women. But at least some good came out of it for, like, future workers. It's a shame to say that at least these owners and scientists knew the dangers but exposed countless people to the radium, and it was all in the name of money. And one thing I should mention is that U.S. Radium had a government contract, so these dolls were being painted for use by the military. So the government was somewhat involved in it, but I mean, I don't know to what degree. But the whole thing is just sad all the way around. Well, that's all I have for today's episode of the Weekend Weird Files. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to come back on Monday for an all-new episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. And y'all have a good weekend.